Hey y'all, welcome back to Poplar Creek Farm. So tonight I'm going to talk to you guys about what in my opinion are the 5 easiest crops for a new gardener to grow. I think it's really important when you're a new gardener to grow things that are not necessarily super easy, but that are something that you're going to get a lot of, production out of, or else you might not want to garden for very long. It is really discouraging when you try to grow something and it doesn't produce, or it just doesn't do well, or it produces but it's a minimal production. So there's a lot of things that can be really discouraging, if they have a lot of issues and stuff. So these are kind of my 5 go-tos for for easy gardening, and especially for beginner gardeners. So number 1, in my opinion, top kind of easiest, really great production or producer, and also really easy to preserve is beans. Bush beans specifically. Pole beans obviously require a little bit more work because you have to trellis them. Bush beans, there's no trellising, there's nothing special that goes into it. Super easy. Put a seed in the ground, water it, and it produces awesome. Beans are one of those things where it's like you have to go out every single day to maintain or to harvest once they are producing, because they just are so prolific. So beans are really satisfying and they're really easy. Number 2 would be lettuce. So certain lettuces, I should say. Cut and come again are in my opinion, the easiest. They're really satisfying because they do grow in the heat still most of the time. Obviously, look at your variety. They should be cool and heat tolerant. Most are, moderately cool tolerant and pretty well heat tolerant, so they don't bolt, which means send up seeds, flowers initially, which turn into seeds. So lettuce is super satisfying because you literally just, once they are big enough, you go out, you cut it with scissors, and it grows again, and it's awesome, and super satisfying. Number 3 would be peas. They do require a little more work because you have to trellis them. They are climbers. You can do it without, but they're not going to produce great. But they're pretty easy to trellis. They're not a super heavy puller on the trellis. Right now I've just got some metal rods and some green gardening fence. That's what I'm using for my trellis, and it's working fine. I even last year used those white little picket fences, which were about this tall, and they worked. They weren't great, but they worked. So, the plant was kind of bending over it, but it did. It worked. And they're really prolific. They produce quite a bit. They're really satisfying. They're not something that's really super great for preserving, but they're very prolific. You can preserve peas pretty easily. You can blanch them and preserve them, but it's more of the work of getting out all the peas to preserve them. Whereas beans, you just blanch them and freeze them, and they're super easy. Oh, hello, Hunter. My little garden kitty. Number 4 on my list would be anything in the squash cucumber family. They actually are all together in a family. They are normally really, really good producers. So if you think about zucchini, pretty much any gardener is giving away zucchini because it's just easy. It's just one of those things that just is super prolific and is a great producer without a whole lot of work. So cucumbers, obviously you can make pickles, which just require water bath canning. There's no pressure canning. They're really easy and they're really tasty. They just produce so much. Sometimes it's hard to keep up with their production. But anything in the squash family, so not all squashes are easy, but most are pretty easy. So things like cucumbers, zucchini, yellow squash, which is summer squash, squash and bugs, butternut squash, things like that are really easy to produce. There are some issues with those pests. Obviously squash bugs can be a really big issue, but overall they're pretty easy, especially your first year. If it's in a brand new garden, not established, the likelihood of you having a whole lot of squash bugs is pretty low, although as you garden in that garden, the more you garden there, the more likely you are going to have squash bugs because they do kind of burrow down for the winter. And number 5 is not always the easiest. It's not something I recommend starting from seed when you're a brand new gardener unless you have the proper setup. But it's one of those things that, in my opinion, is super satisfying, and that's tomatoes. I mean, everybody loves growing tomatoes. So tomatoes are one of those well-rounded, easy things to produce. So I do recommend, unless you have this proper setup, buying started plants. Only because if you don't have the proper setup, you don't have the proper lighting, you're more than likely going to have leggy plants, and then you're going to be struggling from the very beginning, and it's really discouraging when you're starting and everything's going wrong. Been there, done that. I started a whole bunch of tomatoes my first year in a little greenhouse that was inside because it wasn't warm enough outside. There's still snow on the ground because I also started them in like February, which was way too early. And they, put them in a window which didn't have a whole lot of light. It had some, but not a whole lot. None of our windows at our last house had much light. And they were leggy, and I thought they were doing so good. I'm like, oh my gosh, they're huge. Look how tall they are. Well, yeah, they were tall, but they were so skinny and wimpy. And 1 out of probably 80 plants survived, which is like the most discouraging thing when you put in all that time and effort and then they don't do anything. So definitely buy starter plants the first year, or get the proper setup, which means having heat mats for germination, having grow lights. Those are things that are really going to help, but I don't recommend that your first year gardening. I don't think that's something that's really necessary your first year. I think just buying starter plants is not a bad thing in any way. So that's number 5. Also, they're super easy to preserve. So there's multiple ways. Obviously, a lot of people make pasta sauce, spaghetti sauce. You can can stewed tomatoes, diced tomatoes, you can can salsa, and all of them are water bath canned. So as long as you add acid to these, because obviously tomatoes are high acidic anyways, but most recipes do call for some type of vinegar or lemon juice to increase the acidity, and I always recommend following a true recipe for canning. But you can can them. You blanch them, so you boil them for a few minutes, put them in ice cold water, peel the skin off. You can freeze them like that and then use them as you need them, or you can can them, and they're just really easy. There are obviously some pests and whatnot that bug them, and there are some issues, but most of those issues are pretty easy to resolve. So, if you are having some issues with your tomato plants, pretty much you Google images of issues with tomato plants and you describe it, and you can find your issue. One of the big ones is blossom end rot, which is just a calcium deficiency, and it's very easy to identify. So although there are some pests and issues that go along with tomatoes, I think overall they're pretty easy to manage. So these are some things that, those are the top 5 that are easy to produce or easy to grow for new gardeners. I think when you're a new gardener, if you don't have something that, encourages you every day, like you go out and you see it growing or you see it producing pretty quickly and easily, you just don't want to do it. It's not as fun. So for your first year, those are the first 5 that I would definitely start with and recommend starting with. So hope this helped for any new gardeners out there. Please like and subscribe and join me on the next one.